I want to share these words of Martin Luther King to start. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes. Okay. I want to make sure everybody's muted. Yeah. Okay. I have tried to offer the
That's more, you're muted.
I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action, but they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. And I want to read these words of Jesus. Don't imagine that I came to bring peace to the earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies shall be those right in your own household. And then in Luke's Gospel, chapter 21, Jesus raises the topic of international conflict. And then after that, he says this: but before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you, and they will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and siblings, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. Now, when we read here about synagogues and prisons that Jesus was warning his disciples about, he was showing us what happens when there is a blurred line between church and state and how they can together become oppressive. In their particular moment where Jesus was, Jews were forced to the bottom by a predatory state. And we know that there has never yet been a time when some people, Black, brown, female, gay, disabled, different, whom a state does not seek to put down. So today I am asking that God will make you brave. Because look, conflict is a reality of life. Our souls may long for resolution, but it takes exceptional patience to keep looking for chances to make things right when we don't see a path forward in any kind of relationship. Sometimes we put off trying to fix things because we have an illusion that time will heal these wounds. But separation is the illusion. I'm going to say that again. Separation is the illusion, because there is only oneness. And the most destructive of human practices happen when any of us turns our head away from the reality that separation is the illusion. If someone thinks that they are inherently incompatible, it's a trick, because we are all the essence of our Creator and all beings. So why so much conflict? Why your conflict? Okay, maybe sometime in the past you were a jerk to somebody, and later you earnestly tried to repair the rift, but the other party refuses to acknowledge your personhood. By now, you can see God in someone who doesn't see God in themselves. They don't see that there's a massive inclusive presence. And we need to account also for mental health issues, diagnosed or not, which constrain some relationships. In our relationships, the other party may be won over with love, but that means they will need to understand that your separation is the illusion. If they don't see that the distance between you is not real, then the conflict will continue, and you will need to make sure that you are armed with love. To be armed with love is to remain true to yourself, your higher self. You will need to think like Lao Tzu, who said, respond intelligently even to unintelligent treatment. We all have some conflicts that we will not resolve even when we have made multiple attempts. Perhaps you have been feeling like you humiliated yourself by holding out an olive branch until your arm ached. It feels like the dollar amount on the price tag of your dignity was just slashed. But daily, every day, we need to treasure. It's really good to do this. We treasure, we celebrate any restored relationships to any degree. To celebrate true reunion is to celebrate the light. And you know what? We might laugh and joke about other folks' idiosyncrasies. We might make fun of an ex-partner or public figures like politicians and pundits. And you better believe we need to laugh. Probably we're laughing to keep from crying. You can't knock the high value of well-played satire. And I admire people who know how to be just sarcastic enough. But when am I just cranky? When are we just being mean, petty? You see, conflict is a reality, and we must be with the conflict. Be with conflict because, as you may have heard, anything else is madness. When you're in the midst of unresolved conflict, all kinds of emotions and reactions rise and fall, including grief. Everybody has mourned some kind of separation. Many of us found this kind of mourning when Dad and Mom decided to end it. On a macro level, Korean families on both sides of the demilitarized zone have died waiting for the day when they could rejoin loved ones on the other side of the border. I look at myself and I have to look to see how much grief I may be carrying before I say something that need not be said. So knowing these three things help sustain me in the midst of conflict. Number one, it takes courage to enter conflict. And by courage, I don't mean taking a deep breath and diving in head first. Courage is when someone walks up to you and says, wow, you're amazing, such grace under pressure. And you didn't even notice until they pointed it out. Number one is it takes courage to enter conflict. Number two, it takes courage to accept the conflict. And then number three, it takes courage to weather the conflict. And if anybody's asking yourself, where do I get that kind of courage? Well, if we're honest, one reason we are courageous is because we're angry. I try to remind myself that the last four letters of the word courage are R-A-G-E. But pure courage and true rage really flow out of love. And finally, listen, courage, this kind of love that generates courage. Courage comes from words. You might need someone's words right now, someone to tell you that everything's going to be all right one way or another. It may be that the words that bring courage come from inside of yourself. You might have to find words, ways to tell yourself that you must stay in this conflict. You are a soldier on a battlefield. You are a fighter. You are a warrior, and you need words. In the heat of the battle, I must still remind myself that everything's going to be all right. Somehow it's going to work out. But remember these words of Jesus. Jesus says, "For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. I will give you words." Listen, you will hear these words if you will quiet yourself. The words will rise up from within you when you feel like your well has run dry. The words that have been deposited within you, the words that are rising up within you, you need to hear these words in a moment like this. And the words that Jesus gave include things like Luke chapter 6, verse 32, things that Dr. King relied on, where it says, "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them." Sinners are the persons who choose the illusion of separation. So we need words, and we will speak words. We will speak words to ourselves. We will speak words to each other. Did you remember this week to share words with the people who live with you or people far away? These words are expressions of love that will spread courage, and somebody needs some courage today, just like you do. We will celebrate the light by highlighting restoration and healing and reconciliation. We will celebrate the light of restored relationships in the face of conflicts. We will enjoy and inspire one another, even when it seems like we have not gained any ground, when it seems like we have not gotten any closer together. We will abstain from inflicting violence on one another in word or in action. We read earlier when Dr. King talked about Vietnam, he recited these words of Jesus over and over and over, words of love. He spoke words of love because he was not trying to create apathy. He gave words of love seeking to stir up courage. And King said during the ongoing battle that was his life, the tense, grueling, threat-filled battle that he waged every day, it was a battle of love. In his own words, he said, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." In 1967, 1 year to the day that he was assassinated, King's burden when it came to conflict that was international was Vietnam. And he says, "But can we pause and speak about the need for courage to address conflict?" And I'm saying courage means also taking a side. But even as we side with one person or a particular group, we still refuse to hate the ones we oppose. Courage means taking the side of the ones who are being trounced and never really had a chance. We refuse to hate them even when we know that they hate us for not hating the ones that they hate. And if you're wondering which side Jesus takes, because we've got to take sides, you want to know what side Jesus takes when war breaks out. I hate to burst anyone's bubble, but Jesus was not a statist. In other words, he did not prioritize the people in power, but he prioritized the poor. Or in other words, those who have the most to lose when war does break out, not just the Vietnam War, because look, there's always been a war against poor people. All kinds of people may die in war, yet the community of nations places a higher value on the war dead from some families and countries than others. So we should resist romanticizing any war. We should not romanticize wars waged even by countries that label themselves democracies, because as you have seen, so-called democracies can be the most savage regimes of all. Democracies often need to keep enough people in poverty to fill their military ranks. So before I stop this morning, let me read this analysis from Martin Luther King. I am convinced that it is one of the most unjust wars that has ever been fought in the history of the world. Our involvement in the war in Vietnam has torn up the Geneva Accord. It has strengthened the military-industrial complex. It has strengthened the forces of reaction in our nation. It has put us against the self-determination of a vast majority of the Vietnamese people and put us in the position of protecting a corrupt regime that is stacked against the poor. It has played havoc with our domestic destinies. This day, we are spending $500,000 to kill every Viet Cong soldier. Every time we kill one, we spend about $500,000, while we only spend $53 a year for every person characterized as poverty-stricken in the so-called poverty program, which is not even a good skirmish against poverty. Let us pray. Precious Lord, there's so much conflict. We're hoping that the whole world is not losing it. I ask that you make us brave. My friends here, of whom I am so proud, because when they get tired, they don't quit. They are afraid, but they're still fearless. They have been betrayed and sometimes left alone, but they don't grumble. They are angry, but they've chosen to do something about it. And finally, we may continue to experience your divine presence, O God, understanding that your love is poured into us and spread through us by your Spirit. Through the storm, through the night, lead us on to the light. Take our hand, precious Lord, lead us home. Amen. I'm going to ask Diane Fox. Diane was actually there in 1967, April 4th, 1967, when Dr. King brought that speech, Beyond Vietnam. Tell us your impressions, Diane. What's on your heart?
Oh, thank you so much. Is on my heart. The first thing that came to mind is Vietnam as an example of the weakness of violence, of the failure of violence. That it in reaching its aims, not in destroying. It certainly destroyed plenty, but it did not reach its goal.
Could you just take that a little bit farther for us?
I'm not sure I can. What can you give me a question?
Sure. What are the goals? You said it did not achieve its goals. What goals would that have been specifically?
Well, if the US was there to keep two Vietnams alive, to divide the country, to stop the advance of communism, in those ways it failed. It killed what? The counts vary, but 3 million people, 4 million, 2 million, plenty, too many, and left people living with the effects of not only the chemicals that we used. I mean, and your comment about the democracies, when I lived there, it took living there to make me realize, wait a minute, it's the democracies that have caused all these. It's a democracy that used the nuclear weapons. It's a democracy that used chemical weapons. Yeah. Oh.
Wow. Thank you for that, Diane, for bringing it close to us. I also wanted to bring Scott in on this. He's a more vocal anti-war activist. What's on your heart, Scott?
Well, first of all, I'm really grateful for the beautiful prayer from Cheryl and your homily, David. Both
Yeah.
really powerful.
Yeah.
I'm pushed with this question. First of all, I can't get over the fact that Martin Luther King didn't even get to 40, and I imagine what if he had lived. So I'm burdened by the Ukraine-Russian war, and I try to apply what I think Martin Luther King would have said about it, because it's a hard war to challenge, and what our country is doing. And I've said before, Putin is a monster, but I wonder, and it's hard to say this because I know a lot of people don't agree with it, but if we had taken a different road, perhaps, and this will sound really bizarre, but perhaps if Ukraine had surrendered almost up front and exiled, tried to rule from exile, and then given the Ukrainians a chance to do what they've proven twice within the last 15 years, non-compliant protest. Relatively few people died. They overthrew their own government when they needed to, or removed their leader. But what we have now is where we see where violence leads. We've got, 12 million Ukrainians displaced. Who knows how many have died? But once the Russian soldiers who didn't want to be there started dying, you know what happens. There's just atrocities on both sides. There's hate on both sides. And the Russians have, they feel only be natural. Their kids, their husbands, their wives are dying, as in God knows how many Ukrainians have suffered in their infrastructure. So it's like clinging to Martin Luther King. So thankful for his inclusiveness. I think he is a person for all races, all ages. But I kind of cling to him today, thinking about this violence, which, yes, started by a monster, but the response wasn't. It was a response of violence. In the end, what does Ukraine end with? Perhaps they'll save their government, but that's an institution. I asked for the people, but tough words, but correct.
Thank you for shedding light, Scott. Thank you for speaking up today.
I really loved what you had to say about courage and words and the interplay between those two. And also grief. You mentioned grief early on, and I think I'll be thinking a lot today about how grief and courage and rage and words all work together. I think my rage has been kind of drained lately, and yet without rage, you have no courage. So I'm going to be thinking about that a lot.
Thanks for raising that, Caroline. Yes.
You know, Pastor Moore, I like to say we are in the luckiest position ever as we're witnessing from the time of Vietnam to now, the collective consciousness of saying no. Of saying, you know, we're not going to blindly follow. And you know what? That took courage. It took courage of a generation. So Diane, Scott, that generation that stood up and said, no. Thank you for the courage to do that, because now that has given the opportunity. When wars break out now, it's like, why? We ask just outright, why? Before it was like patriotism, throw all the blinding, propaganda to the front so that we can just blindly follow into some kind of reckless, unthought history. But now we don't have that. We have the ability to look at it and have an opinion about it. And that was from the courage of those folks in the 60s. I love the hippies. Thank you. And I love Martin Luther King. That whole movement from that era has given us hope. It's still having a lasting effect.
Power to the people, power to the hippies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was glad you said that word about rage and courage. Last night I was at a small dinner party. Everyone there was a Democrat, but some topic came up that reflected on racism, and I felt this rage inside of me. I was so angry, and I don't think I spoke with rage, but I think I spoke with anger. Well, maybe they're two together. That shouldn't be, and that we need to speak out and ask questions and not just say, oh, racism has always been. Well, that's true, but it's always been wrong. And when I came home that night, I was still kind of angry inside. Somehow I had just thought that group of people would be on board, and they weren't really. And I was confused about my anger, when you said that, I understand. It's my passion for something right that makes me angry. I appreciated everything you said.
Thank you, Kathleen, for those words, reminding us, bringing us back to the value of rage, the power to strengthen us, to give us courage. Let's hear from one more at least. And I don't want to cut anybody off,
I would just say, Kathleen, that what you're describing is something as I've gotten older that I've experienced, and that is a visceral reaction to things. And I've learned to really listen when my body is telling me, like that rage that you were instantly feeling and that uncomfortableness you were feeling. I think that's really when we have to really listen to our ourselves and our bodies and our reactions, because we can't really put it into like our thoughts and our words exactly, but we just know, we're just feeling like you have to kind of go with it. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but
Okay, say that
Um,
last part again.
that you have to really like you can't really put it into words or thoughts, but you just know something's not quite right, or something's like making you feel uncomfortable. And so it's like it just kind of is in your gut, and you're just like, and you have to kind of spend some time to search and think about you know, what's going on and where that's coming from. The other thing I wanted to say was I loved where you said we are all the essence of our creator. We are all capable of getting along. And I feel like our society, that is absolutely not a part of our society. I mean, you know, populations, you know, live separate from each other. I mean, I feel like we just think we're supposed to be separated from each other, that it's just normal and natural. But it's not, and it's not what God intended, as you're saying. And I think that's something that we don't really talk about very much or think about. But I really appreciated what you said about that.
May we talk about it and think about it more, Tanya. And I see Lisa's hand is up.
Yes, but I hope we don't end with my comments. So I'm going to try and say the one comment that was just I ended up writing down was basically wars and conflict is basically a fundraiser for munitions dealers, which is equivalent to greed and capitalism without accountability. And so I don't want to end with that because it's rather negative, but that is what I got out of that. Martin Luther King said, this is wrong, and we need to totally rethink this. And how do we express that rage that comes from courage? And I think artists do that beautifully, like dance. More than anything, when I'm in an emotional state, dance helps me. Art, to create out of that rage, I think is a perfect way to utilize it and to focus it in a good way. So
WOW. Well, before we stop, I got to bring Constina in on the conversation. So, yeah.
Everything that was said was good. You know, the MLK holiday just brings me back. It's an emotional holiday for me. My father passed away, and I remember that the only time I saw my father cry is when he got the news of Dr. Martin Luther King's death. I remember him coming in the house and falling on his knees in front of my mother. And I remember him walking across the greenway toward our house because I was outside. And I could see in his face that something had happened. So I followed them in the house. And he fell on his knees and he looked at my mother and he said, "They killed him, Mama." And I didn't know who he was talking about. And then but I cried because my father was crying and I'd never, ever seen him cry before. And I didn't know that then, but I think it planted a seed of passion against injustices in my life. Seeing something like that make my father, you know, cry I think I was 8 years old, and you know, never really understood the whole MLK march and all that. I was kind of like maybe protected from it to some degree, but it was enlightening. And then further on in my life, you know, looking at the protests, the hippie movement, you know, the anti-Vietnam movement, Muhammad Ali and his stand, my introduction to Malcolm X, you know, Black Panthers, all of that came through my father's experience in exposing us to that. But my dad also had a lot of rage because of his experiences. So he was courageous, but you know, growing up, I saw a lot of rage. And so your message of remembering to love, because I think in some aspects, he modeled that to where I kind of have to remember to love, to act it out. I know it's there, but I have to remember to make sure that I am actively walking in love towards those who disagree with me, those who maybe have become complacent. So your message was just a perfect reminder of the importance of love and courage and what all that means together.
Hmm. As we're talking, as you were talking, Constantina, I was thinking about of late conversations here and there that I've had with people around the theme of capacity. How much can we take? How much should we expose ourselves to? And this is where it's really important to attend to the spirit.
Mhm.
Our source. And that means, again, knowing how to quiet ourselves and to listen to the voices, the messages that give us power. Well, thank you all. Peter is going to lead us in communion at this time.
Okay, well, hopefully you have something that would represent the elements this morning. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me."